A slap clean, fierce, and loud enough to make the whole training yard freeze isn't just a reaction, it's a statement. It's the moment a young black officer draws a line in daylight against a predator wearing the same badge. He thought she'd back down. He thought she'd play by the old rules of silence and shame. But what he didn't know is, she's not just another cop. She's the one who'll expose everything. What starts as harassment turns into a firestorm of internal corruption, retaliation, and a courtroom showdown that changes everything. And trust me, you won't see the final move coming until it hits. Tell us where you're watching from and what time you're tuning in. Drop a comment below, we read every one of them. It was just past 10 in the morning when the sun began to burn hot enough to sting through polyester sleeves, and the scent of summer sweat crept up from the concrete. The precinct lot was half-full radios, murmuring low from the open patrol cars, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed like a lazy insect. You wouldn't expect something ugly to happen in a place so ordinary, so well-lit, so public. But that's the thing about power, real power. It doesn't need to hide in the dark anymore. It just waits for the perfect moment to show you who really owns the daylight. Officer Raina Thomas stepped out of her squad car, adjusted the strap across her chest, and felt the weight of the vest settle against her ribcage. 26 years old, 2 years in uniform, and already she knew how to measure every room by the tension in her shoulders. She nodded to 2 officers. Across the lot got a nod back from one and a smirk from the other. She let it go. You learn quickly what to ignore. Her boots clacked against the pavement as she crossed toward the front steps, keys in one hand, radio on her hip, chirping with a dispatch update about a domestic out east. Then came the voice, familiar, slow, soaked in that condescending charm that made her skin crawl. "Thomas," he said, like her name tasted different in his mouth. "Got a second?" Sergeant Mike Dennison, 19 years on the force, veteran of 2 precincts and untouchable in the eyes of most of the command. He was leaning against the railing, coffee cup in hand, sunglasses, hiding whatever look might have been behind his words. Raina hesitated only a second before turning. "Yes, Sergeant." He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if offering advice. "You've got your belt too high. Can't reach your cuffs quick like that. Mind if I—" She started to say no, had it right there on the tip of her tongue, but he was already reaching. His hand brushed her waist, fingers sliding low under the radio, and for a heartbeat nobody breathed. Raina's chest locked tight. Her spine turned to stone. The warmth of his hand wasn't what shook her. It was the ease of it, the casual entitlement, the absolute confidence that no one would stop him. Her voice didn't come. Her feet stayed still. She felt her pulse hammer against her jaw. And right then, right there in the open morning sun, 3 other officers stood less than 30 feet away. One shifted his weight, pretending to check his phone. Another walked past without looking. The third just stared down at his boots. Dennison grinned, pulling his hand back like he'd done her a favor. "Gotta be sharp out there, Thomas. Wouldn't want someone getting the jump on you." She stood frozen, jaw, tight breath, shallow, trying to make sense of the heat in her face and the cold running down her spine. She nodded once barely, and turned away, walking stiffly up the steps, the weight of his touch still clinging to her uniform like a stain. Inside the precinct lobby, the air conditioner hummed a steady drone, but it did nothing to cool her rising nausea. She moved to the locker room, dropped her bag on the bench, and stared at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. Her eyes looked the same, but something behind them had shifted, like a door had opened and couldn't be shut again. Was that all it took? Just one moment, one man, one hand. To strip you down in front of everyone and make the world pretend it didn't happen. A knock at the door broke her trance. It was Officer Kim, a young rookie just a year in. He glanced around and said quietly, "You okay?" Raina forced a half smile. "Yeah, just tired." Kim nodded, eyes lingering a second too long, unsure whether to believe her. He left without pressing. She leaned on the sink and whispered, "Don't let it get to you. You're stronger than this." But that wasn't the truth. Not really. The truth was, she didn't feel strong at all. She felt alone. And angry. Not the hot, explosive kind of anger, but the slow-burning kind that simmers behind the ribs and waits for a reason. That reason came 10 minutes later, out on the training field behind the precinct. She was running drills with the rookies, barking commands, her voice sharp, her eyes sharper. She needed to move, to sweat, to feel something other than the filth clinging to her memory. Dennison came out from the garage, sipping his coffee like nothing happened, nodding at a group of younger officers. He strolled over, leaned against the fence, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Glad to see Officer Thomas took my advice. Looking tighter already." The words hit her like gravel in the gut. She stopped mid-sentence, chest heaving, and turned slowly toward him. He smiled. That same smug, untouchable smile, and then he reached again. Just a gesture, just a light touch on the small of her back, like claiming ownership. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just moved. The sound echoed across the field like a firecracker. Her open palm cracked against his cheek, hard enough that his sunglasses lifted off his face and shattered on the concrete. Silence. Every head turned. Every breath stopped. Dennison stumbled, eyes wide with disbelief, blood trickling from where the frame had nicked his temple. Raina didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Her voice came out low, steady. "You don't touch me." It was not a scream. It was a sentence. A verdict. And for the first time that day, someone finally looked at her and saw a badge that meant something. The slap still echoed in her ears long after the sound had faded like thunder bouncing off canyon walls that refused to forget. For one breathless second time had splintered. Now it was catching up all at once, like a gust of wind, slamming into a closed door. Raina stood on that training field, hand still slightly raised, pulse hammering behind her eyes, as every pair of eyes burned holes into her back. No one said a word. No one dared. She turned without another glance at Dennison and walked away, slow, measured steps on the hot asphalt, as though each one carried the weight of something irreversible. Behind her, the only sound was the crunch of broken sunglasses under a boot. No one came after her. No one checked on her. The silence didn't feel like protection. It felt like warning. Inside the locker room, the fluorescent lights flickered faintly, and the hum of old wiring buzzed somewhere overhead. The mirror showed a version of her face she didn't recognize, drawn, flushed, eyes wide but strangely calm. She ran water over her hands, the cold biting her skin, grounding her. The slap had been instinct, a reflex born of fear and fury fused too fast to separate. But the silence afterward, that was louder than anything. It screamed through the empty hallways and echoed off the badge pinned to her chest like a challenge no one wanted to answer. There had been a moment as she passed the hallway toward the sergeant's office where she saw two officers whispering in a corner. They didn't stop when she walked by. One of them, a man she'd trained with, tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. She didn't need to hear the words to know what was being said. The story was already mutating. Later that afternoon in the briefing room, she felt the shift in the air before anyone spoke. Dennison wasn't present, but his shadow was thick, suffocating, unseen but inescapable. Captain Mendoza addressed the team with the forced neutrality of someone who already knew which side he had to appear on. "We are looking into a personnel incident," he said, voice low, clipped his eyes, pointedly avoiding hers. "No one is to discuss it. That's an order." There was a beat of stillness, then the shuffling of papers, the rustle of bodies, pretending to focus on the schedule for the next shift. Raina sat near the back arms, crossed gaze steady, but her chest felt like a live wire. She noticed Officer Kim glance toward her just once, quick and unsure, then look away again. After the meeting, she stood alone near the coffee machine, pretending to wait for a fresh pot that wasn't coming. Officer Tully passed by an older man, someone who'd been kind to her once, maybe even protective. He slowed, opened his mouth like he might say something, then thought better of it, and kept walking. That more than anything broke her. She went to the rooftop to breathe. Up there, the wind moved differently, sharp, restless, scraping against her skin like invisible grit. From that height, the streets below looked orderly, peaceful, almost clean. But she knew better. There were layers beneath every silence, and this one was deep as a grave. She sat on the concrete ledge, her legs, heavy elbows resting on her knees, eyes unfocused. Her thoughts spun in tight circles. Why didn't they stop him? Why didn't I speak sooner? Why does the uniform protect him more than me? She remembered her academy oath, the pride in her father's voice when he pinned her badge on. She remembered telling herself she could help change things from the inside. But the inside, she was learning, had its own rules, and none of them were written down. You were expected to swallow things, laugh them off, let the little things go until they weren't little anymore. The door creaked open behind her. "Hey," said a voice, soft, cautious. It was Officer Kim again. She didn't turn. "What?" He hesitated. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened. I mean, not all of it, but enough." She looked over her shoulder, one brow raised. He shifted awkwardly, hands in his pockets. "I'm not saying it out loud, I get it. That wasn't right." Raina gave a slow nod. "Number. It wasn't I. He lingered, waiting for her to say something else, but when she didn't, he exhaled and headed back inside. She stayed on the rooftop a while longer, watching the sky harden into a midday blaze. The sun didn't care about fairness. The badge didn't guarantee safety. And the silence, this heavy, deliberate, coordinated silence, wasn't just from fear. It was policy. An unspoken agreement that said, don't make waves, don't break ranks, don't be the one who speaks when the rest pretend they didn't see. Back at her desk, someone had left a file folder half open. Inside was her shift report returned for revision. In the margin, a red ink note read, "Tone too assertive. Watch attitude. No name, no signature. Just the message." The message was clear. That night, Raina sat on her apartment balcony, legs curled beneath her, nursing a warm mug of black tea and trying to make sense of the stillness. Her phone buzzed, once unknown number. She didn't answer. The stars above blinked faintly through city haze, and somewhere below a car alarm went off, then stopped. In that moment, she realized something fundamental had cracked, not just in the system, not just in her department, but inside her. And once cracked, it couldn't go back to how it was. The slap had been a beginning, not an end. And the silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was preparation. A space filling with everything she'd refused to say until now. The next morning arrived with a sky so clear it almost felt like a lie, as if the world itself had forgotten what had happened just the day before. The precinct parking lot buzzed with the same dull rhythm, officers coming in for morning briefings, coffee cups steaming on dashboards, radios crackling static about overnight arrests. Everything moved as if on a well-worn track, like nothing had shifted, like nothing had cracked through the surface of normal. But for Raina Thomas, everything had shifted. The slap had changed something irreversible, not just in her, but in the air around her, in the way people looked or didn't look when she entered a room. She walked into the training yard that day with her shoulders squared tighter than usual, her eyes narrowed against the morning sun, and a growing sense of distance forming between her and everyone else. Even the rookies who had once looked to her for quiet encouragement now seemed unsure, their glances quicker, their small talk stilted. She didn't blame them. Fear moved faster than the truth ever could. Sergeant Dennison hadn't shown up for roll call, but the absence wasn't comforting, it was loud. His name floated through corners of conversation, half whispers, wrapped in sarcasm or contempt, never loud enough to land, never brave enough to say what needed to be said. Raina knew what was coming next. She could feel it in her gut, the way animals sense storms before clouds even gather. The drill began with a basic takedown routine. Raina watched from the sidelines, clipboard in hand, as two rookies fumbled through the motion, their timing off, their stances weak. She stepped forward, dropping the clipboard onto the bench, her voice steady but sharper than normal. "Stop. Do it again. And this time, pay attention to your damn balance." The younger officer, a lanky kid with nervous hands, nodded quickly and reset his stance. The other, a girl with a solid grip but unsure footing, looked briefly toward Raina, then back down at her own boots. Raina folded her arms, resisting the urge to rub her temples. She knew her tone was clipped. She knew she was bleeding stress into every syllable. But what else could she do? She couldn't scream. She couldn't break down. All she had left was control. That was when Dennison returned. He didn't walk across the yard. He strolled slow and easy, like a man arriving late to his own party. The coffee cup was back in his hand, the sunglasses replaced by a new pair, mirrored lenses gleaming like polished steel. Raina saw him coming before anyone else did. She felt the ground shift beneath her before he even said a word. Well, he called out loud enough to slice through every conversation. "Looks like Officer Thomas is running a little boot camp this morning." She didn't answer. She didn't even blink. He moved closer, stopping beside her like nothing had happened, like his face hadn't been cracked in front of half the department. "Heard there was a little misunderstanding yesterday," he said, voice low, now meant only for her. No hard feelings. She could smell his cologne, sharp, synthetic, overbearing, and feel the heat of him standing too close like always. She felt her fists clench inside her pockets, her shoulders locking into place. Then he leaned in just a fraction and added, "You swing like you've done it before. Maybe you have." She turned toward him slowly, her mouth-dry eyes searching his for any sign of remorse. But there was none. Just that same smirk, the one he wore like a second uniform. He stepped even closer, placing a hand lightly, deliberately on the small of her back. That was it. Her body moved before her mind had time to second-guess. The palm of her hand rose like instinct, and the slap came fast, fierce, final. It landed with a sound like thick ice cracking across still water, clean, deep, undeniable. His sunglasses flew off again, this time ricocheting off the concrete and skidding beneath the squad bench. Blood bloomed across the edge of his cheek, a small slice from the frame that had once shielded his entitlement. Everyone turned. No more pretending. No more looking away. He stumbled back a step, blinking, stunned, not from the pain but from the fact that she had done it again, that she had dared. The training yard froze in collective disbelief. Reina's chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Her hand trembled slightly at her side, but her face was stone. "You don't touch me," she said, the words falling not like fire but like iron. "Not ever again." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded with every eye, every breath, every fear that this moment had dragged into the daylight. One of the rookies stepped back, shaking his head. Another whispered something under her breath. But no one moved. No one tried to defend him. Not this time. Dennison straightened, wiping the blood from his cheek with the back of his hand. He looked at her for a long second, something behind his eyes shifting, maybe calculation, maybe rage, maybe shame. But he said nothing. He turned, picked up his coffee cup, and walked back across the yard like nothing had happened. Again, Reina stood there, heart still drumming behind her ribs, knowing full well this wasn't over. That slap, just like the one before, wasn't closure. It was declaration. It was the sound of a system being challenged by someone it never expected to fight back. And as she looked around at the faces now watching her with something closer to respect, something closer to fear, she knew she had just crossed another line. But this one she chose. By Monday morning, the precinct didn't feel like a workplace anymore. It felt like a waiting room for something terrible everyone was pretending wouldn't arrive. The same hallways that had once felt familiar now held a quiet pressure like air before a storm, thick and humming with suspicion. Reina felt it the moment she stepped through the side entrance, her boots echoing against tile that suddenly sounded colder, sharper. Conversations paused when she passed. Coffee cups were raised too slowly. Eyes flickered away too fast. She made her way to the locker room, but her hand paused at the handle when she saw something different. A strip of yellow caution tape had been tied in a knot around the handle of her locker, cheap and theatrical but unmistakably intentional. A message. She pulled it off in one firm tug, opened the locker, and found everything inside had been rearranged. Her backup vest flipped her files, scattered a smear of what looked like mustard across the inside of her cap. It wasn't just a prank. It was a message from someone who wanted her to feel unsafe, unwanted, unprotected. She took a slow breath, closed the door, and whispered to herself. You expected them to clap. The mirror caught her reflection again, shoulders squared, jaw set tight, and she realized she didn't even look surprised. Later that day, she was summoned to the captain's office without explanation. The blinds were already drawn, and Captain Mendoza sat behind the desk, arms folded, face unreadable. An internal affairs officer was seated beside him, a woman Reina didn't recognize, holding a notepad that had already been opened, pen hovering just above the paper. Mendoza cleared his throat and gestured to the empty chair. Officer Thomas, there's been a report filed concerning an incident on the training field last Thursday. He began, his tone wrapped in official restraint, like a man rehearsing lines written by someone else. Sergeant Dennison has made a formal complaint. He's described your actions as aggressive and unprovoked. Reina blinked once. Unprovoked. The IA officer glanced up, pen poised. He alleges that you assaulted him without warning and that your behavior was a result of personal animosity, not professional concern. Reina leaned back, folding her arms. Did he mention the part where he put his hands on me? Silence. Mendoza shifted, uncomfortable. Sergeant Dennison claims he made no physical contact. She exhaled slowly through her nose, keeping her tone even. And you believe that? The IA officer didn't flinch. We're not here to determine belief, Officer Thomas. We're here to investigate conduct. It was the kind of phrase she'd heard before, used by people who wanted to sound fair while already holding a verdict in their tone. She knew better than to argue in that room. She nodded once tight and measured, then rose from the chair. As she walked out, the quiet buzz of the hallway seemed to turn louder, like a swarm just out of sight. Two officers leaned against the vending machine, laughing about something, until they caught sight of her and suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. Another passed her in the hallway and muttered, "Careful, Thomas. That temper's gonna cost you." She stopped walking but didn't turn around. She didn't have to. The comment wasn't meant for conversation, it was meant for corrosion. Just another drop in the slow, deliberate drip of disapproval. That's how it always started. Not with shouts or fists, but with cold shoulders, missed calls, subtle removals from schedules. By the end of the day, she noticed her patrol assignments had been quietly shifted. Her name had been removed from a scheduled ride-along with a community outreach program she'd helped launch. Her desk phone no longer rang with check-ins. The silence was spreading, organized and precise. In the break room, Officer Kim approached again, eyes darting toward the hallway before he spoke. "Hey, I heard about the complaint. Look, I don't know what he said, but I saw enough to know he's full of—" She raised a hand gently, not unkindly. "I know, Kim. You don't have to say anything. You don't owe me that risk." He frowned. "It's not about risk. It's about what's right." She offered a tired smile. "Then say it when it counts. Not just to me." He hesitated, then nodded and left. Alone in the silence again, Raina stared out the small window above the microwave, watching the sunlight fall across the asphalt outside. Even the light felt colder now. The badge on her chest still caught the sun the same way, but the warmth behind it had gone. What haunted her wasn't just the retaliation. It was the knowledge that so many had seen what happened and chosen stillness. And in their stillness, they'd made their choice. She closed her eyes and breathed in deep, letting the tension flood her chest before exhaling it slow. The slap had made noise, but the smear campaign, that was quieter, more efficient, and far more dangerous. Because silence doesn't need to shout to ruin you. It just needs enough people willing to look away. It was late Tuesday when the envelope showed up on her desk, tucked between a pile of shift logs and overdue reports like it had been there all along. There was no name on the front, no department seal, just a plain, white envelope with her name scrawled in black ink, the handwriting too neat to be rushed, too careful to be random. Raina looked around the bullpen, but no one was watching her, at least not obviously. She slipped it into her jacket pocket and waited until she was alone in the upstairs records room to open it. The room itself smelled like old paper and dust and air conditioning that never quite worked. Fluorescent lights buzzed above and outside the window. The sky was beginning to dim with the first hints of evening. She opened the envelope slowly, half expecting something childish or threatening. But what she found made her breath stop. Inside was a printed copy of an internal report, heavily redacted but unmistakable in structure. It was a misconduct investigation summary, 3 pages long, with Sergeant Dennison's name printed at the top and the words "subject of complaint" typed beside it. The file outlined 3 separate incidents, all filed by women on the force within the past 8 years, all involving inappropriate physical contact or unwarranted proximity in the line of duty. None had resulted in disciplinary action. All had been marked inconclusive due to lack of corroborating evidence. Beneath each summary was a small note: complainant declined further cooperation. And Raina knew what that really meant. It meant they got tired. It meant they got scared. It meant someone warned them, subtly or not, that pushing forward would cost them more than they were willing or able to lose. Her hands tightened around the paper as she kept reading. The dates lined up like stepping stones, and with each one she could feel the floor beneath her shifting. He had done this before. And the department had known. Maybe not everyone, maybe not out loud, but someone had known. And still he wore the badge. Still he walked the halls like he owned them. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the silence. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "You're not crazy, just not the first." That was it. No name, no context. But somehow it didn't feel threatening. It felt like confirmation. Like someone had been watching, not to intimidate, but to bear witness. To say you're not alone. She folded the paper, slowly placed it back in the envelope and tucked it into the inner lining of her backpack. Then she stood for a moment, frozen under the humming lights, trying to quiet the voices inside her head. There was no joy in being right, only weight, and the realization that if she backed down now, it would not just be her story that got buried, it would be theirs too. Back at her apartment that night, the lights felt too bright, so she left them off and let the television play muted in the background. She sat at her kitchen table, the envelope in front of her, a cup of lukewarm coffee cradled between her palms. Her mind kept circling the same questions. Why was this hidden? Why hadn't it mattered the first time, or the second, or the third? And then one deeper, quieter question emerged. Why had she believed it would be different for her? She thought about calling someone her father, her old academy instructor, maybe even Officer Kim, but there was nothing to say, not yet. This wasn't about comfort anymore, it was about clarity. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized the truth wasn't just in the file, it was in the redactions, in the silence, in the resigned tone of those notes that said, "Declined further cooperation." She whispered to herself, they didn't decline, they were defeated. That thought hit her harder than she expected. She closed her eyes, let her head rest against her folded arms and just breathed for a while. Outside, the city kept moving, uncaring. Cars passed below. Music floated from an open window across the street. But in her small apartment, time thickened into stillness. When she finally lifted her head again, her eyes settled on the badge hanging near her door, the same one her father had pinned on her when she graduated. He'd whispered then, "This badge can protect others, but don't let it silence you." She hadn't understood what he meant at the time. Now it felt like prophecy. The next morning she made a copy of the file and stored the original in a fireproof box beneath her bed. She placed the copy in her shoulder bag and took the long way to work, walking 3 extra blocks under the wide, empty morning sky. She wasn't sure yet what she was going to do with it, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't be handing it back. The truth was in her hands now, fragile but alive, and for the first time since all of this began, she felt something stronger than rage, something steadier than fear. She felt resolve. And once it takes root, resolve doesn't let go. The decision didn't come like thunder. It didn't crash down or burn bright or scream for attention. It arrived quietly in the stillness of her apartment just before dawn, while the city still slept and the coffee hadn't yet finished brewing. Raina sat at her kitchen table staring at her badge, resting beside her phone, the silver catching faint traces of morning light that slid between half-open blinds. She hadn't slept much. The file lay open in front of her again, but this time she didn't read it. She just looked at it the way you look at something you've already memorized by heart. She had a choice to make, and both paths were steep. Her phone vibrated once, her lawyer's number lighting up the screen. She picked it up not because she was ready, but because delay had already cost her too much. His voice came through low and clear, laced with concern and fatigue. "You sure you want to do this, Raina? There's no going back once you file. You know that." She nodded, even though he couldn't see. "Yeah, I know." He exhaled slowly. "Look, I believe you. But I've seen this play out before. If you take it to court, they'll come for your record. They'll paint you as unstable. They'll twist your words, question your behavior, your attitude, your past. They'll pull every camera angle that makes you look angry and ignore the ones that show you holding back." "I know," she said again, this time firmer. "But if I don't, I'm just helping them bury it." There was a pause on the line, long, heavy. "I'll get the paperwork ready," he said finally. "And Raina, be careful who you trust." When she hung up, the apartment felt too quiet. She stood, poured her coffee, and carried it to the balcony where the city was beginning to stir. Horns in the distance, a dog barking below. A school bus lumbering around the corner. Life unchanged, as if her entire world hadn't tilted. She thought about her mother's voice, soft but firm, telling her as a girl, "Baby, there will come a time when silence feels safer than truth. But that's how the good ones disappear." And maybe that's what this was about, not just protecting herself, but refusing to disappear. By the time she reached the precinct, the sun was already high, the heat rising off the pavement in shimmering waves. She kept her head down as she walked past the familiar rows of squad cars, her fingers brushing against the edge of her badge clipped to her belt. Inside, things looked the same. The same dull lights, same murmurs of paperwork and tired jokes, but now everything felt thinner, more fragile, like a sheet of glass waiting to crack. Captain Mendoza passed her in the hallway, offered a short nod, and kept walking without a word. She could feel the questions in his silence, unspoken but loud. In the break room, 2 officers suddenly stopped talking when she entered. One of them offered a forced smile, too quick and too wide. She ignored it. She had her own silence now. But it wasn't the silence of shame. It was the kind that comes before a storm. She met her lawyer at a nearby office, off-site neutral ground. The walls were beige, the chairs slightly too stiff, the air conditioning humming with the indifference of bureaucracy. The paperwork sat on the table, thick and stark. Allegations, timeline, witness statements, or the lack thereof. And that redacted file scanned and appended labeled simply, "Supporting Evidence Unofficial." She signed her name slowly, the pen feeling heavier with every stroke. When it was done, she leaned back, eyes closed for a moment, as if bracing for an earthquake that hadn't arrived yet. "You just crossed the line," her lawyer said softly. "I know," she replied. "It was already drawn. I just decided to stop pretending it wasn't there." Back at the precinct, she returned to her desk to find her access to certain systems had been restricted. No warning, no explanation, just a message blinking on her screen. Permission denied. She knew what it meant. The isolation had begun. The slow administrative unraveling. They weren't going to fire her, not yet. But they were going to make her feel like a ghost in her own building. She stood up, glanced around the room, and caught sight of Officer Kim down the hall. He met her gaze, held it just long enough to offer a nod. Not a big one, just enough to say, "I see you." And right now, that was enough. She made her way to the locker room, opened her locker, and ran her hand along the inside wall, where she'd once taped a quote from her academy days. The paper had been torn down, just the edge of tape still clinging. Another message. But she didn't feel fear. Not anymore. What she felt now was something sharper, cleaner, like steel forged in heat. She whispered to herself, "This ends with the truth, one way or another." And as she stood there alone beneath the flickering lights, she realized that she hadn't just made a choice between speaking up or staying quiet. She'd made a decision about who she was willing to be, no matter what it cost. The coffee shop sat on the edge of the old district, one of those places where the walls were lined with mismatched books, and the music played low enough that you had to lean in to hear each other. Raina had never been there before, but it felt right the moment she stepped in dim lighting, worn wooden tables, and the faint smell of cinnamon that clung to the air like memory. She took a seat by the window, her back to the wall, hands curled around a cup that had gone lukewarm by the time they arrived. Two women, both older, both familiar in a way that had nothing to do with face and everything to do with presence. One wore a dark blazer, straight-backed eyes alert beneath thinning gray hair. The other had soft lines around her mouth and hands that trembled slightly as she lifted her tea. They introduced themselves as Brenda and Lieutenant Carver, both retired, both once proud to wear the same badge Raina now carried with such burden. For a moment, no one said anything. They just sat in that quiet corner, letting the weight of shared experience fill the space before the words did. Brenda spoke first, voice low, steady. "You did what most of us never dared to do. You stopped him." Raina looked down at her cup, fingers tightening slightly. "And now I'm paying for it." Lieutenant Carver gave a small, knowing smile. "Of course you are. That's how the system defends itself. Not with force, with coldness." They told their stories in pieces, like handing over small stones from deep pockets. Brenda had filed a report in '08. She'd been new optimistic, still believing that truth had weight. The investigation was inconclusive, and within months her assignments had shifted, her evaluations began to sour, and she was quietly encouraged to transfer out. She lasted 2 more years. Lieutenant Carver had held on longer, 12 years. Her report never made it past the lieutenant's desk. No one called her a liar, but no one called her back either. The silence spoke louder than any denial. "He's been protected," Carver said, her voice like gravel. "By people who don't even like him but fear what his exposure would say about them." Raina listened without interrupting, absorbing every word like scripture. These women weren't bitter. They were tired. Tired in the way that comes from screaming into rooms that were never built to echo. And still, they had come. Still, they had reached out not for revenge, but so the next woman wouldn't be alone. Brenda leaned in. "You think they hate you now because you slapped him number. They hate you because you made it visible." That stuck with her. They talked for nearly an hour, pausing only when the waitress came by with refills and tired smiles. Raina asked questions, took mental notes, listened to things she'd felt in her bones but never heard out loud. Things like how internal complaints often go missing. How phrases like "not substantiated" are code for "we won't touch this." How protecting the department's image has always been more urgent than protecting the women in uniform. Before leaving, Lieutenant Carver handed her a folded napkin with 2 phone numbers written on it, one for a civil rights attorney, the other for a journalist who knows how to listen when women in blue whisper. Raina tucked it into her pocket like something sacred. Outside, the sun had shifted just enough to cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the noise of the street felt louder than when she'd arrived. She walked 3 blocks in silence before pulling out her phone. She didn't call anyone. She just stared at her reflection in the screen, a young woman standing between the ghosts of those who came before her and the threat of what might come next. Later that night, she sat in bed with the lights off the city buzzing faintly beyond her window. She replayed their words again and again. It wasn't just about Dennison anymore. It was about everything he represented, about how a system could train you to carry a gun, wear a badge, risk your life, and still expect you to keep quiet when that same system turned against you. She thought about quitting, not for the first time. She thought about walking away, letting it all slide back into silence, letting the story fade the way the others had into footnotes and regret. But something deeper pulled at her, not anger, not even pride, just a bone-deep refusal to let them win by waiting her out. She whispered into the dark, "I'm not just surviving this, I'm burning it into their memory." And in that stillness, she realized something else. What she was doing wasn't just for herself. It was for Brenda, for Carver, for the woman who would wear the badge after her and deserve more than whispers. The courthouse didn't look like justice. It looked like bureaucracy, steel-framed glass doors, pale tile floors that echoed too loud when you walked, and fluorescent lights that hummed just enough to fray your nerves. Raina stood at the entrance for a moment before walking in the envelope tucked under her arm, containing everything: the formal complaint, the affidavit from her lawyer, and the redacted report that had followed her like a shadow. Her heels clicked with quiet precision against the floor as she passed the security checkpoint, nodding politely but briefly to the guards who glanced at her badge, then looked away too quickly as if they already knew why she was here. The clerk behind the glass took the papers with a neutral face, flipping through them with mechanical detachment. "You'll be contacted about the court date," she said, stamping a corner without looking up. It was done. Just like that. No ceremony, no fanfare, only the weight of what she had started settling deeper into her chest. Outside, the air was warmer than she remembered. She crossed the plaza slowly, feeling each step like a question, each breath like a challenge to the silence still clinging to her from the precinct. The wind caught the edge of her coat as she walked, and for a moment she imagined it tearing something off her, some layer of expectation she no longer needed to carry. Filing wasn't victory, it was risk. It was the sound of a single voice thrown into a system that had taught itself to be deaf. Back at the station, the reaction wasn't loud. It was quiet, measured, calculated. Her schedule was adjusted again, no explanation, no warning. She was pulled from community patrol and reassigned to traffic citation duty, a silent demotion disguised as administrative necessity. Calls she used to get regularly stopped coming. Backup arrived slower on her radio, sometimes not at all. The message was clear: you speak out, you work alone. She opened her locker that afternoon to find it untouched, but emptier somehow. As if the absence of vandalism now spoke louder than the presence of malice. Like they no longer needed to threaten her, they were just waiting for her to fold, to break. But Raina didn't break. She grew quieter, sharper, more deliberate in every step she took. The worst part wasn't the retaliation, it was the normalization of it. The way people she'd trained with began to treat her like something fragile or volatile depending on the day. The way conversations died the moment she entered a room. Not out of malice always, but out of fear. Fear of association, fear of becoming the next target, fear of standing too close to someone the system was already trying to erase. One afternoon, Officer Kim stopped her outside the parking lot, voice, low eyes shifting to make sure no one was too close. "I heard about the court filing," he said. "Just wanted you to know. I respect what you're doing." Raina studied his face, trying to read the spaces between his words. But she asked. He hesitated. "But be careful. They're watching everything now. Every move." She gave a slow nod. "I know. That's why I'm making everyone count." That night she sat in bed with a notebook open on her lap, listing the names of every officer who had quietly supported her even for a second, and everyone who had deliberately looked away. She wasn't building a revenge list. She was building a map, a landscape of silence and courage marked not by titles or rank but by the decisions people made when it mattered most. Days turned to weeks. A local paper ran a brief, understated blurb about a civil suit filed by an unnamed officer against a supervisor for misconduct. It didn't name names. It didn't spark outrage. It barely registered, but someone had leaked it, and even that was something. Even whispers leave footprints if you follow them close enough. In the community, things felt different. Older women in her neighborhood began stopping her on the sidewalk, placing gentle hands on her forearm and whispering blessings. At the grocery store, a man in his 70s slipped her a folded note that simply said, "Some fights aren't about winning. Some are about remembering we're still worth defending." She didn't know his name, but his eyes were kind, and his words stayed with her longer than any headline ever could. She wasn't naive. She knew the department wasn't going to crumble because she filed a complaint. She knew Dennison had friends in places that made accountability a distant hope. But she also knew this every action she took added friction to the machine. And if enough friction built up, even the most protected gears began to grind. She watched them now, the ones who used to laugh too loud or look too long. They didn't mock her anymore. They watched her like a question they didn't know how to answer. That in itself was a shift. One day as she left her shift, she passed a mirror in the hallway and stopped. Just for a second. She looked at her reflection, not for vanity, but for proof. That she was still here, still standing, still wearing the uniform but not the silence. The evidence room always smelled like old paper, warm plastic, and forgotten time, quiet as a chapel, cold as a vault. Raina didn't come here often, not unless she had to, but today was different. She stood by the long metal shelves, lined with numbered bins and cardboard boxes, her fingers tapping lightly against the case log binder. Across from her, Officer Kim held a thumb drive like it, weighed more than it should, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't supposed to pull this. Technically, it's from the overflow server. We only keep active patrol cam here now. But I saw your name on the dispatch notes." The date matched. Raina took the drive from him slowly, her eyes scanning his for any hesitation, but all she saw was quiet conviction. He looked tired, not physically but morally, like someone who'd spent too many days watching the right thing sink beneath the tide. "You watched it?" she asked. He nodded once. "Part of it? Enough." Raina felt the weight of those words settle across her shoulders like a second uniform. Enough. It was always just enough to be undeniable, never enough to be safe. They left the evidence room without further conversation, and she carried the drive like a match waiting to be struck. Back in her apartment that night, she turned off every light except the one beside her desk. The computer screen flickered to life soft blue against the dark, and the moment the file opened, she knew this was the missing piece. The dashcam belonged to a rookie assigned to Shadow Patrol that week, parked in the far end of the training lot, his unit barely visible in the chaos of drills. The camera's angle wasn't ideal, half blocked by sun glare, and slightly crooked, but the audio was clear. Too clear. The moment Dennison's voice rang out across the lot, dripping with condescension, followed by the sound of footsteps, and then that unbearable silence, her heart clenched. And then came the slap, sharp, undeniable, followed by his low growl and the stunned exhale from those standing nearby. But what made her stomach twist wasn't the impact, it was what followed. The camera kept rolling, and another voice, one she hadn't heard at the time, came through like static sharpening into clarity. It was another officer, laughing, saying, "Told you she had fire. Should have grabbed her first." Raina's hands froze on the mouse. Her jaw tightened. She played it back once, twice, 3 times. There was no mistaking it. Not the tone, not the meaning. The rot wasn't just in Dennison. It was wider, deeper, more comfortable than she'd realized. She copied the file 3 times, one to a secure cloud, one to a backup drive, one to a sealed USB that she placed inside the lining of her winter coat. Then she sat in the dark staring at the frozen frame on her screen, the paused image of the training yard so ordinary, it almost felt sacred now. The truth was in there, crude, unfiltered, and absolutely real. The next morning she didn't tell anyone. Not yet. She walked into the precinct with the same expression, same stride, same quiet fire under the skin. But every corner she passed, every familiar hallway looked different now, not because the place had changed, but because she had. She was no longer guessing, no longer wondering if she'd imagined it. She had proof, and proof carried its own kind of gravity. At lunch, she sat across from Kim at the edge of the cafeteria, speaking without moving her lips too much. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer," she said. He nodded. "If this goes public, are you willing to testify? You found it on your own?" He didn't respond immediately. He wiped his hands on a napkin, looked down, and then looked back at her. "I'm not the one who made the mistake. I'm not the one who should be afraid." That was all she needed to hear. By Thursday, her lawyer had a copy. The internal affairs investigator reluctantly received another. The third went into the hands of the journalist lieutenant. Carver had once trusted a woman whose voice on the phone carried both curiosity and quiet rage. "You sure you want to go on the record?" she asked Raina. "No," Raina replied. "But I'm going to." The article hit 3 days later. Not a headline, not yet. Just a deep dive column buried 2 sections entitled, "What One Camera Saw Allegations of Silence and Surveillance in Local Precinct." It didn't name her, but the story was unmistakable. It quoted policy manuals, cited misconduct statistics, raised questions no press had bothered to ask in years. Inside the precinct, no one said anything, but everyone moved differently, slower, tighter, like the ground had started to shift beneath them, and they weren't sure how to balance. Raina kept working, kept showing up, but now she didn't walk alone. The silence wasn't gone, it never really goes, but it had started to break at the edges. The kind of break that spreads like a fault line when you press just hard enough. And for the first time since it all began, Raina didn't feel like she was chasing justice. She felt like it was finally following her. They called it an emergency hearing, but the energy inside the administrative hall that morning didn't feel urgent, it felt loaded, controlled. Like everyone present already knew what was about to happen, but didn't want to be the first to say it out loud. The room wasn't built for drama, cream-colored walls, pale tile floors, and a long oak table that stretched like a silent boundary between the accused and the accusers. Raina sat at the far end, her posture, upright hands folded tightly in her lap, the quiet hum of the overhead lights keeping time with her heartbeat. Captain Mendoza sat at the center, flanked by 2 division chiefs and a legal advisor from Internal Affairs. He looked older than she remembered, not just tired, but burdened like a man caught between policy and conscience. He didn't meet her eyes right away. Neither did the others. They flipped pages, whispered, adjusted pens and microphones, and then Sergeant Dennison walked in, still wearing the uniform, still smirking like none of it mattered. But his shoulders didn't sit quite as squarely as before. His eyes scanned the room too quickly, lingering a beat too long on Raina. For the first time, he looked like someone unsure of the ground beneath him, like a man who'd spent his life walking on water and finally heard the ice start to crack. The proceedings began in dry language, the kind that turns moral injury into procedural phrasing, incident under review conduct, unbecoming use of force in non-combative context. But Raina didn't flinch. She watched. She listened. She felt the shift begin slowly, not in words but in air. Then they played the video. There was no dramatic cue, no raised volume, just the sudden reality of footage cutting across the room like a scalpel. The training yard appeared on screen, bathed in morning light, and then the sounds followed. His voice, her stillness, the slap. And then that off-camera voice, careless and cruel, sealing the truth with one reckless sentence. No one moved. For a full 5 seconds after the clip ended, the room was frozen in stillness so complete that even the air vents seemed to hold their breath. Then Mendoza leaned forward, slowly removing his glasses, and finally met her eyes. This time he didn't look away. He cleared his throat. "Sergeant Dennison," he began, based on the footage submitted and the corroborating internal complaints, now under independent review, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension without pay, pending full disciplinary inquiry. Dennison started to protest something about context, about manipulation, but the words died halfway through the sentence. No one was listening to him anymore. Not really. Raina didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was no longer mistaken for fear. It was power. Outside the hearing room, the hallway buzzed with the quiet murmur of reaction officers leaning close to one another, trying not to speak too loudly, but unable to contain what they'd just witnessed. No one had expected it to move this fast. No one had expected the department to act at all. And yet the wheels had turned. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not completely, but undeniably. As she stepped outside into the afternoon light, Raina felt a different kind of exhaustion settle into her bones. Not the fatigue of surviving, but the ache of finally being seen. She stood on the front steps, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, and watched as the precinct doors closed behind her. Kim caught up with her 5 minutes later, his jacket half-zipped, breath catching in the wind. He stood beside her without speaking at first, just watching traffic move by on the street, the sun beginning its slow descent across the sky. "You did it," he said eventually. "No," she replied, not turning. "I started it." He nodded, understanding. Still, that room felt different today. She looked over at him, her voice low. "It's not over. You know that, right? He smiled faintly. Maybe not, but it's not quiet anymore, and that more than any ruling or headline was what mattered. The silence had cracked, and once it cracks, it never returns the same. Inside the precinct, people would whisper. They'd shift. They'd rethink the things they'd laughed off or dismissed. And for the next woman, the one who might hesitate before speaking, the path, though still steep, might be just a little clearer. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, Raina reached into her pocket and pulled out the shattered frame of Dennison's sunglasses, the ones he'd dropped that first time, the moment that started everything. She'd picked them up quietly without knowing why. Now she held them like a relic, a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it cracks glass slowly and clean. She turned toward the street and walked, not away, forward. The courtroom wasn't built for revelation, it was built for order. White walls, high windows, pew-like benches that creaked with every shift of weight, and a judge's bench raised just high enough to remind everyone where power was expected to reside. But that morning, as sunlight poured through the slatted blinds in long pale bars, the room didn't feel like it belonged to power. It felt like it belonged to truth. Raina sat at the front of the room, hands clasped gently on the table, posture upright but not rigid. She wasn't here to perform. She wasn't here to plead. She was here to confirm what had already been proven on camera in silence, in bruised dignity, left too long unattended. Her lawyer sat beside her, his voice quiet but sure, his notes crisp, his pacing respectful. They weren't arguing the truth anymore. They were simply placing it on the table like a piece of shattered glass that no one could sweep away. Across the aisle, Sergeant Dennison sat with his own counsel, eyes down, jaw tense, the confident mask he'd worn for so long finally beginning to slide. The courtroom wasn't packed, but the people who mattered had shown up: officers in plain clothes, a few community members who'd followed the story, and two women Raina recognized immediately, Brenda and Lieutenant Carver, seated just behind her faces, calm hands folded. The testimony was brief. The facts had already spoken louder than opinion ever could. The footage was played once more, projected onto a screen that bathed the room in cold light, and when the slap landed, no one flinched. They'd heard it before. What mattered now was what followed it. The silence that had once protected him now, hanging in the air like smoke, and the voices that had begun quietly to rise in its place. When Raina took the stand, the courtroom didn't shift. No heads turned, no gasps followed, but there was a stillness, a listening stillness, that hadn't existed months before. She spoke clearly, without flourish, without bitterness, without apology. She described what happened, what she felt, what she feared, and what she chose to do. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her voice was a steady pulse, like a drumbeat under soft earth. "I didn't file this because I was angry," she said. "I filed this because I refused to disappear." There was a pause, not from her, from the room, like a collective breath being held for just a second longer than expected. The judge nodded slightly and moved on. The closing arguments were quiet. The facts had weight now, and no one dared pretend they didn't. When the jury left to deliberate, Raina stepped outside into the hallway, her hands trembling for the first time all morning. She leaned against the cool marble column and stared out the tall window as traffic rolled slowly past. Kim appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Still black?" he asked. She managed a small smile. "Always." He handed her the cup and leaned beside her in silence. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside, a bus pulled away from the curb. A child chased a pigeon across the sidewalk. Normal life untouched and relentless. Then the bailiff called them back. The verdict didn't ring out. It settled soft but irreversible. Guilty. Of misconduct, of battery, of abuse of authority under color of law. Not just a word. A reckoning. Dennison didn't look at her as the sentence was read. He stared ahead, his jaw locked, his hands unmoving. He'd been warned this might come. But knowing and believing were not the same. As the courtroom emptied, Raina gathered her things slowly. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. Outside, Carver stopped her at the door, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said softly, "You didn't just speak for you. You spoke for all of us." Raina nodded, emotion swelling behind her eyes, but held steady in her chest. "I hope someone hears it." Carver smiled. They did. Even the ones who won't admit it yet. Brenda hugged her, brief but strong, and then slipped out the door without another word. Kim offered to drive her, but she shook her head. She needed to walk, to feel the sidewalk under her feet, to feel the sun on her face without flinching. As she passed the news, vans parked across the street. She didn't stop. Reporters called her name. Cameras clicked, but she didn't look back. She wasn't a headline. She was a woman who chose not to stay silent. A woman who made the system say yes to the truth, even when it wanted to say nothing at all. 6 months later, the station looked the same, but Raina had learned that surfaces were only that, surfaces. The same gray bricks, the same worn steps that had carried her in and out for years. The same heavy door with a hinge that still squeaked just slightly when pushed too quickly. But behind it, something had shifted, subtle, like a change in temperature, like air after rain. And at the center of it, now stood her. She didn't wear the standard uniform anymore. Not because she'd left the force, but because the force had changed its relationship with her. After the verdict, after the headlines cooled, and the cameras turned elsewhere, Raina had received a promotion, not loudly, not with a ceremony or a cake in the break room, but in a sealed envelope and a new office on the second floor. Internal affairs. A place where patterns mattered. A place where silence was no longer policy. She hadn't accepted out of ambition. She'd accepted because if she didn't, someone else would sit in that chair with less reason to remember. And memory, she had come to learn, was a weapon as powerful as any badge or firearm. Her office was modest frosted glass, a small desk, a bulletin board already peppered with names and notes, some pinned with string, some just circled in red. She didn't look at them as cases. She looked at them as stories that someone had tried to stop too early. Every morning she arrived at the same time, coffee in hand, quiet in her steps. Officers who once turned away now nodded. Some even stopped to ask her opinion. Some did it out of guilt, some out of respect. She didn't need to sort them. She didn't carry bitterness in her chest anymore, just resolve. That morning she walked through the hallway where Dennison's photo once hung. It had been removed, not publicly, not with drama, but someone had taken it down. The empty space remained an outline, still faint on the wall, and Raina never asked who did it. Some truths didn't need to be spoken to be felt. Outside, the weather had turned. Late autumn light filtered through the branches like honey, and the air carried that mix of dry leaves and diesel. Raina stood in front of the memorial wall that bordered the south lot, a quiet stretch of polished black stone etched with the names of fallen officers. Candles sometimes left there, notes tucked into cracks. She visited often, not because she knew every name, but because she believed in honoring weight. That day she brought a single white flower wrapped in brown paper and laid it near the bottom left corner. Not for a name, but for the women who never made it here, those who resigned quietly, those who never reported, those who had tried and been erased before the ink could dry. As she stood there, her phone buzzed. A message from Kim. Just 2 words, "It's starting." She smiled softly. Somewhere down the street, the community center had agreed to host a new listening session, anonymous officer-led with real accountability and follow-up. The idea had come from a conversation they'd shared weeks ago while standing in the hallway after a long debrief. Raina replied simply, "Be steady." She turned back toward the building, her coat catching in the breeze. A rookie officer opened the door for her wide-eyed, holding it a little too long. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. She nodded. "Good morning, officer." And just like that, the door swung closed behind her. Her office smelled faintly of old folders and clean air. The blinds were open. A new case file waited on the desk, a woman's name, a timestamp, a complaint without a witness. But now she knew better than to underestimate a single voice. She placed the file in the center of her desk, took a sip of her coffee, and whispered quietly to herself, "Let's begin." Because the badge on her chest no longer felt like armor. It felt like a promise, and daylight finally had nothing left to hide. Sometimes justice doesn't come crashing in with sirens or spotlights. Sometimes it begins with one woman refusing to be silent. Raina's story reminds us that dignity isn't granted by rank or uniform. It's something we must defend every day, especially when systems forget the people they were built to protect. She didn't start this fight seeking glory. She started it because the silence around her had grown too loud. Because every woman who came before her deserved better, and every woman who comes after needs to know that silence is not her only option. We learned through her that speaking up may come with a price, but staying quiet often costs far more. We saw how fear is enforced, not just through violence, but through inaction, indifference, and cold looks across familiar rooms. And we saw how truth, even when whispered, can move mountains when someone dares to listen. So if this story moved you, if it made you reflect or remember or simply feel seen, then please don't let it stop here. Click the like button so others can find this message. Share this video with someone who still believes in quiet courage, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that speak not just to the moment but to the conscience. Because in a world that often forgets its own lessons, stories like Reina's help us remember who we are and who we're still trying to be.